Hello and welcome to this wonderful event from the Greenwich Economic Forum today, looking at the rise of sustainable investing and investing on environmental, social, and governance principles. That's ESG. We just had a fantastic session on women's financial inclusion, and this panel will pick up some of those similar themes, I imagine, but ESG and sustainable investing is absolutely booming, setting the scene here. Why? Why is that? There is a growing realization that extreme weather events pose threats to businesses seeking investment. Governments are also taking steps to limit the emission of greenhouse gases, and that can have a real impact on firms' future revenues. And clients want change. Amid these pressures, how is it that investors truly know the harm and the good that firms are doing? And how will ESG investment be affected by the coming change in administration in America? These are some of the issues we're going to think about today. Just before we begin, I wanted to say to everyone watching that if you are having any trouble accessing this content, please make sure that you are using Google Chrome as your browser. And then a reminder to take advantage of the networking features that we have here by searching and connecting with other attendees and sponsors during the networking breaks. It is utterly wonderful to be joined today for this fireside chat on sustainable investing and ESG principles by Afsaneh Beschloss, who is the CEO and founder of RockCreek. She's had an amazingly varied career, has worked for JP Morgan, has worked for the World Bank and the Carlyle Group. And she's going to bring that wealth of experience to the session today. We're utterly thrilled to have her. We are taking questions, so you can use the Q&A function to engage with Afsaneh, and I'll do my best to sort of try and bring in some of those questions and to put them to her. So to start us off, Afsaneh, I mean, I sort of characterize the lay of the land as I see it initially, but I wondered if you could tell us about the growth in ESG investing that you yourself have witnessed over your time in the finance sector.
Miranda, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction, and very exciting to be part of the Greenwich Forum, and we're talking about climate. And it was only, I think, 2 years ago when at the Greenwich Climate Economic Forum, we got stuck in Greenwich because of a major snowstorm. So it is interesting to be doing this by Zoom today, and much warmer weathers, at least on this side of the ocean in the east coast of the US today. But in terms of looking at climate and investing in things related to broadly ESG, I wanted to say that, it's been a long time in coming. I remember when I was at Oxford, I had a professor who started something called the Oxford Energy Institute. And we started looking early at natural gas as a replacement for coal, even in those early days. And when I first joined the World Bank, we were investing in oil and gas and traditional fuels, but increasingly we were investing in solar, in wind, and other new technologies. And it was very interesting because a lot of the Nordic countries were very interested in this and helped us finance some of the early, I would say, more advanced technology type of investments in renewables. Obviously, at that time, renewable energy was not super economic. The costs were very high compared to traditional energy. And I think what is very interesting comparing those days to today, how far down the cost of solar energy and of wind energy has come to be very competitive, in some cases actually lower than the cost of traditional hydrocarbon fuels. So the picture has changed a lot, and during this time also the investments have changed. And the only other thing I will just touch on is the very interesting thing during COVID is that while a lot of oil and gas companies started calling themselves energy companies, what you see is that the other side, which is investments in hydrocarbons, have come to very, very low levels, while investments in renewable energy has continued even during this very difficult time in the economy. More broadly in ESG, similar trends, whether you look at education or health or financial inclusion or housing affordability, all of these areas have grown tremendously to be areas with very strong returns for investors, institutional and retail investors. And I think that is why we see the numbers on investments going up, and that's why we see the performance being strong.
On that point about returns, Afsaneh, I mean, there used to be a bit of a tale that went around that essentially, you had to build in a certain virtue discount if you went into ESG investing. I mean, that's patently not the case anymore.
You're so right. And what is interesting, even 2-3 years ago, I think I love the term you're using, virtue, element and measurement, which we added on to say, these things are not really economic, but you would be doing good to look at them. And I think that sense has changed a lot, because just look over the last 9 months. For example, you take health sector. It's been one of the booming areas because of COVID, but also it has become very evident to everyone that the access to health services was not equal. In the US, we've seen actually the health situation for large parts of the population get worse. So what we find is that investing in health is a good thing, and the returns have been higher. And where you put technology together with health, or you put technology together with education, that is where everybody is not only investing, but using. All the kids at school, all people at college, we're having this meeting by Zoom. So it means a lot of the technologies that we were investing in really over the last few years have been the best investments to have. And I would say that, the idea of you don't have to think of it as doing good and doing well. These are going to be the highest return investments. Again, if we look at oil and gas over the last year or two, or looking forward, it's going to be much more a situation where people are going to be investing in renewable energy versus oil and gas, just purely from an investment point of view. So that idea of the virtue, I think, is going away. The other point that is often used is the idea of how do you measure externalities. And I think what we have learned is that what we called externalities, which was anything except for capital and labor, really the environment we live in, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soil we grow on, all have real value. And so now we're starting to look whether politicians agree or don't agree to measuring. I think people on the planet are starting to measure, and especially the next generation and younger people, who will force the rest of the population on Earth to start investing in these areas.
And I wanted to try and sort of fit in what you're saying a little bit, perhaps into a slightly broader look at sort of ideologies almost, and ideologies in investing. I mean, the dominant one, arguably since the 1920s, has been that value investing is the way to go, and you should look at a company's assets, its cash flow, its track record, the kind of Warren Buffett school of investment, and it's actually underperformed over the past 5 years, and we're seeing all sorts of research now coming out questioning the approach. Asset management appears to be in transition, essentially, and that's partly because it's more difficult now to understand what's going on. I mean, you mentioned it yourself, with the importance of technology. A lot of companies now have intangible assets. They rely on network effects, externalities, as you mentioned. Do you think that, I mean, would you agree, firstly, that there is a sort of shift in investment ideology underway? And do you think that it's possible that ESG investing, could be an ideology of sorts that really rises to the forefront as a result?
I completely agree with that premise, but I also think that ESG will be much more integrated. It won't be this standalone thing that, standing by itself there. Every time we're trying to invest, you're going to look at, what is good for investors has to be good for the rest of the stakeholders. And I think that is exactly what you were alluding to, I think, post the writing of Friedman and others who really looked at the economy from a very narrow point of view. What we're learning is that if one part of, let's say, again, taking capital and labor, a lot of the economic gains went to people who were in finance or were holding capital, right? Versus labor, versus other areas. So if you're creative and you're adding to growth in the economy, you should benefit from that. If you are working hard, you should benefit from that. If you happen to be fortunate to move capital from here to there, maybe you should benefit. But the question is, again, have that within reason as all the other resources going into the economy. So I think when we talk about the roundtable, discussions that started a year ago, and a lot more discussion about not just equity, but purely from an economic growth point of view, you do need to have an economy that is thriving. How do you get an economy that is thriving? People having living wages. If people don't have living wages, they cannot consume. If they cannot consume, you're not going to have growth. And it's very interesting because if you look at US versus China right now, especially post-COVID, and we can talk about the politics and the other issues that are going on in China, but purely from an economic point of view, we're going to be landed with a huge amount of debt. We already have huge amounts of debt from the fiscal spending that we have undertaken the last many months compared to China. We have not been investing in the financial sector. Our financial sector is still very, very old-fashioned, right? And a lot of people who, again, have interest in keeping asset management or finance the same way as before have kept it the way it is. Whereas in China, you find people are already using digital currency, moving ahead to, getting money wired almost freely compared to here. So a lot of achievements on that side. Same thing with the virus, having the tracing and being able to, again, putting aside the issues about privacy, the fact that they have been able to get it under control so much faster. They're also bringing together efforts on the vaccine. So when you look at what we're learning on the economies, you do need more equity. You do need more equity for growth, and you need that for a healthy, thriving economy. And I think COVID has really made that clear to all of us that we do need to invest in a more equitable economy.
And how are you at RockCreek doing that, Afsaneh? I mean, sort of get crunchy for a minute. How are you making the call about, which of your investments really do, sit under ESG? How are you deciding, which firms are actually kind of doing what they claim to be?
That is such a great point, because what we find, and often we don't even want to like to use the terms because there's so much negativity in some of the terms used by in the marketplace. But what I find is really interesting is, number one, we have been putting a lot in both in emerging markets and in US and Europe, let's say in the health sector, over the last 5 years. So what we're finding is that some of the investments we made, particularly in the private area, happen to be with companies that are now producing the vaccine, companies that are improving access to healthcare. Exactly the kind of companies that are benefiting today, but also companies of the future. Similarly, in education, we did a lot in investments in long distance learning. Again, we thought that would be something, for the longer term, but now the longer term has been squeezed into a few months. And I think one thing, Miranda, that is worth talking about is that if we look at the 10 largest companies 20 years ago versus 10 years ago versus today, they have changed so much. And that is one of the reasons, you talked about value investing, but in general, the economy is much more dynamic. Companies that were, whether it was Exxon, that was part of the larger set of companies in the US, now no longer part of that set. And similarly, in emerging markets, if you go and look at the companies that have really been benefiting, they lie in the intersection of technology, health, education, finance, and everything else that touches our life, like housing that is bringing in technology to be more efficient, and so reducing the costs hugely. And if we look at things like that, in also even in rural communities, there's unbelievable wastage of energy, and that is the case in the US. It is the same in emerging markets. So huge investments that could be made that would be great for returns, and we're looking at some of those as we speak. So again, on climate, the kind of stocks that we have been investing both on the private and the public side have done a lot better than traditional energy. And I have to tell you, I did study natural gas for a very long time and still believe that natural gas is a great transition fuel. But if we're looking in the sort of forward lens, we need to look at the companies that will thrive in the next 10 years, not the last 10 years.
Absolutely. And sort of on that point about, kind of natural gas and being a bridging fuel, I mean, you do get these kind of trends, don't you, in kind of climate discourse and in terms of green solutions, and we should do this, or actually we should, methane should be our focus this year. How do you at RockCreek sort of sort out, what is an investment kind of for the moment, and what is one with a slightly more medium to long term time horizon, and how do you not get caught up in sort of potential groupthink around a particular technology at a particular moment, such as the way a few years ago everyone was kind of really focusing a lot on natural gas.
You're so right. And, it's interesting because if we concentrate purely, very simply at things like, carbon emissions, right? Often carbon emissions stand for two things. One is actually energy efficiency, which means using less energy also emits less carbon. So that's like a no-brainer in terms of investing. And it's something that we did at the World Bank, that we do at RockCreek, and I think will continue to be there for, it's not a fad, and it will continue. In terms of sort of switching in one form of energy to another, that is where the discontinuities in costs have really made renewable energy much cheaper. Hydrogen is starting to become really interesting in Europe. And there's a lot more conversation about hydrogen in the US. So what you see is that every electrical utility in the US now is talking about moving its sources of energy from coal, certainly, to renewables. And it's not going to be overnight. All of these are long-term investments. For us, it's long-term investments. And for the transition, there will be long-term investments. And that's why I think carbon emission measurement is a really good way of looking at things, whether it is looking at renewable energy or looking at increasing energy efficiency.
I mean, we've sort of touched on this issue a little bit, but as the externalities of greenhouse gas emissions are not accurately priced into the cost of energy, I mean, ESG-minded investors may not always have the very strongest financial incentive to force a firm to, for example, to shut down its quite lucrative oil fields. I wondered kind of what your thoughts are on carbon taxes and, whether that will gain traction in the coming years.
I think you will have to have global carbon taxing for it to work. If you have it in one part of the economy or in one set of countries and not, it will not be necessarily as effective. But as we speak, people are still using gasoline in their cars. So we're not going to, go electric overnight. I use an electric car, but once you use an electric car, I find you can't go back to gas using cars. But it's been a long way in coming, but I think the next 10 years we'll see a lot more uptake across both individuals, but also public transport switching. But you will still, you don't need to close down every field, because you'll still need some of that energy, at least for some time. And if you look at every single CEO of an energy company, or I should say most of them, now call their companies energy companies, not oil and gas. They talk about not investing in hydrocarbon new exploration. They talk about investing in new research in renewables. And I remember when I was at the World Bank, I took a year off and I worked at Shell. And I remember they had a very big renewable area at that time, which then they shut down because renewable energy was not economic. So this time it's different in the sense that it's now very cheap. Middle Eastern countries are investing in renewable energy. Texas, biggest energy investments in Texas are in renewable energy. So we are in a very different cost structure. So what you were talking about in terms of externalities are very much internalized now into the cost structure. So hopefully it's not just using shadow prices to measure externalities.
It's been a huge week for news. Afsaneh, as I'm sure no one watching this is unaware. I wondered your thoughts on what ESG-minded investors, what message they'll take from Joe Biden winning the American election.
I think Joe Biden's winning of the election in the US is a really, really important step for broadly people who are interested on the climate side, but also looking at opportunities on the climate side. First of all, in the US, anyone who has visited the US recently, you know that we need a lot of infrastructure investments. So since we need those investments, and those investments are both job creating plus they're necessary in order for the economy to function more efficiently and better and at a higher level, you might just as well use renewable energy. You might just as well use new technologies more broadly to have a more efficient infrastructure. So it's not just energy that goes into it, but it's also the technology that goes into it. So I think that with President-elect Biden, that is a huge area of emphasis. People keep on talking about the 2 trillion in investments, but whether it's 2 trillion or 1 trillion or whatever that number is going to be, that money will get invested. If you look at job creation, it's really interesting because there's always a lot of political conversation about jobs lost in coal or jobs lost in hydrocarbons. You have about 500,000 people working in renewable energy and many more people getting added on. That are getting added on every year. Similarly, you've had people losing jobs in those other areas, whereas 1 million spent, what we studied actually at World Resources Institute, is that every million that you spend on renewable energy is going to create double the number of jobs. So it's really important for President-elect Biden to emphasize the fact that these are areas where you can help grow the economy, and you're going to be having much more impact on job creation than continuing to invest in traditional economy and traditional fuels. And last but not least, having less reliance on the Middle East and the rest of the world for energy is a really good thing from many points of view. And the Middle East itself is starting to invest in renewable energy. So that tells you something.
Yes, I knew the time would run away from us, so it would be remiss of me if at this point I didn't tell those watching who aren't aware that you are actually a board member of Gavi, which is the Global Vaccine Alliance. So I'd love just to ask for your thoughts on, the exciting news we've had today that there's a possible vaccine out. Obviously, there seems to be euphoria in many quarters, in many places, but what should our responsible reaction be to this news?
I think on the one hand, we all yearn for good news, and I'm excited that, there are good news on this one particular vaccine. I think what we have also learned, if you listen to Peggy Hamburg, who also is on the board of Gavi and was a FDA commissioner, basically the vaccines that are being worked on currently, the ones that have made it to further stages, are probably more like around 50% effective. So just like sort of most flu vaccines. So even with that, the fact remains that at Gavi, the job of Gavi is to get vaccines to the low-income countries, and that has been the traditional vaccines, the measles, polio, etc. And they've been unbelievably effective in doing that. So they have created a system and infrastructure, a really incredible process to do that. And they're working with the COVAX facility to do the similar things in COVID. But to get a lot of vaccines to a lot of people all over the world, a vaccine that needs to be kept in cold temperatures right now, as you know, and you need to have the glass vials and you need to distribute them. And there are going to be people today who politically or otherwise are uncomfortable with taking this vaccine, means that we will still have quite a long way in front of us where we are keeping our masks or doing distancing and being careful and not really going back to exactly our old way of living for a little while until we really know more about the effectiveness of the vaccines.
Of course. So sort of slightly tempered enthusiasm.
Exactly. And I don't want to make it too, pour cold water. I think it is exciting. It's just that the practical parts of it also are very complex. So.
Yes, of course. And Afsaneh, just a last thought. I watched a fantastic interview you gave where you explained that your mother once told you, no one can take away your education. So study hard. You take it with you. I mean, what education are you hoping that those watching this panel have taken away today? I mean, sort of what are the most important things to understand about ESG investing at this point from your perspective?
You're so kind to mention my mother, and she continues, by the way, to say the same thing. And what have I learned? And I think the one thing about ESG that is really important, I find there are people who looked at ESG, and as you very interestingly said earlier, so learned that it was virtue and that it was not economic. What we have learned in the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 5, and then particularly in the last year, is that in fact these investments do have serious returns. The companies of the future are the ones that we all see doing really, really well as we speak, private companies or public companies. So the world has changed, and the world where investments, let's say by some of the venture firms in renewable failed 5 years ago, 7 years ago, that's the past. Right now, a lot of those investments actually are doing quite well. So I think having an open mind about ESG investing is a good thing. At the same time, you have to be careful not to be swung by the marketing and the greenwashing that also is going on alongside it. So you have to do your own homework, like with everything else, like with news, right, Miranda, and with everything that we learn, and continue to learn. And I think all of us will find that in a year's time, in 2 years' time, there's all kinds of things that we didn't know. But ESG is getting integrated, whether we like it or not, into the way we traditionally invested.
I am afraid we have to finish there, but Afsaneh, thank you so much for your time today. I've learnt masses. It's been an utter delight to have the opportunity to speak to you. And I should say to all our audience, stick around. There's going to be a wonderful session after this, and it's a panel on inclusion as a global investment imperative. Thank you all again, and thank you, Afsaneh.